Well, Congressman Hamilton, thank you very much for taking the time to share your time and your expertise with us today. We're going to ask a few questions, and also I should thank you for helping to create the Partnership for Secure America and to serve as its co-chair and to be an active member of it.
Yeah.
Your role is obviously indispensable from the beginning until now, but we wouldn't be where we are as a successful NGO working on foreign policy and national security.
Thank you.
On behalf of Bipartisanship. And what we like to call is fact-based, results-oriented approaches to foreign policy. So I have a couple questions, and we'll just go through these one at a time. I wanted to ask you, since we focus a lot on Congress, and you served so many years in the House and as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, what do you believe should be the proper role of Congress in the conduct of American foreign policy?
First, I think you have to recognize that the president is the chief foreign policy maker and, of course, implementer as well. The Congress plays really only a marginal role in foreign policy, not close, I think, to being a co-equal to the president on foreign policy matters. Having said that, what the Congress does can be very important. I think what the Congress has to do is to try to be a partner and a critic. Those are almost contradictory roles in a sense, but both are very important. The president needs often support to carry out his policies, but he also needs an independent voice to criticize what he's doing, both constructively and negatively. And I think the tension that exists between the role of partner and critic, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, from that tension emerges better policy. So the Congress's role is not equal to the president's, but it's a very important role if it's properly done. And to do it, I think they have to be supportive at times and critical at times.
How do you think the current Congresses have been in terms of meeting those requirements?
Not very well.
Okay.
I think the oversight responsibility of the Congress on foreign policy has really suffered in recent decades, perhaps. It's not as robust, demanding, curious as it should be. And I think presidents should welcome scrutiny from the Congress. The Congress's attention has usually been focused much more on domestic matters that arises out of the politics of the body. But I think Congress has a way to go to strengthen its role in foreign policy.
Why do you think there's been this slippage in terms of congressional responsibilities for oversight in recent years?
Well, it's part of a much larger phenomenon. It doesn't just relate to foreign policy. Congress has two roles. One is legislating and the other is oversight. And the oversight role is not as attractive to members. And as a result, I think it's suffered. Congress fails to see how important the oversight role really is if done properly. The media doesn't pay as much attention to it as it does to the legislative side. Outside groups don't pay that much attention to it. But I believe strong, demanding, tough oversight is a critical part of making a representative government function properly. And I'm disappointed, frankly, that the Congress is not much more vigorous than it is in pursuing oversight. Congress ought to be calling in every single foreign policy official of any rank, giving them a tough period of questions, demanding answers from them, providing support where they should and criticism where they should, but make a president spell out in detail what his policy is don't let him get away with generalities. Make sure that once he announces a policy, there is tough follow-up. Is the policy being carried out? By whom? How effectively? Get some metrics in there as to how well we're doing. So I think we've got a long way to go in terms of the Congress fulfilling its oversight role on foreign policy as well as domestic.
Well, thank you for that. That's very, very interesting. Can I shift to a more substantive issue on cybersecurity? The other night we had a dinner, and we had about 25 congressional staff at the dinner. And we went around the table and said, what are your major concerns that you're having now? And much to my surprise, there was a kind of generational change from the old days that we were all concentrated on geostrategic issues. Mm-hmm. They started citing a number of other kinds of issues. Climate change was one. The debt and issues of can we pay for things, the budget and so forth. But one of the things many of them cited, many of the staffers cited, was cybersecurity. Yeah. And you've named cybersecurity as one of the number one threat facing the United States today, and you push for the creation of a national cyber center. What do you think we should be doing to implement steps to combat the threat of cyber attacks in the United States?
Well, I'm not sure it's a good game to play, although I play it now and then, ranking national security threats. We have a number of national security threats. They're all important. They all have to be dealt with. But it is true that I singled out national security. The largest threat to it some months ago was cybersecurity in my mind. The reason for that, I think, was that I think our vulnerabilities are so great with regard to cyber attacks. And another reason is we've been very slow in responding to it. Even today, this debate about what you do on cybersecurity goes back years. And we have yet to pass effective legislation from the Congress on cybersecurity, comprehensive legislation. They have trouble getting anything done in the Congress on cybersecurity, not to its credit. But on the executive side, which has the major responsibility, I think we've likewise been slow. Now, what do you need to do? Well, there are two big aspects to cybersecurity. One is offensive, the other is defensive. We hear very little about the offensive side. I have some knowledge of it, but very smattering. My assumption is we're very good at it, that we're better than anybody else in the world. We don't write that in the headlines, of course, but the offensive side, I think, is quite good. We do not publicize everything we are doing by way of trying to attack other targets. That's okay, I guess, and there are reasons for it, although I think more information should come out on it than has. What does hit the headlines regularly is the defensive side. And here it is beyond doubt that we're lagging, and lagging seriously. So what do we do about cybersecurity? The thing is we need to up our game with regard to the defensive aspects of cybersecurity. When 4 million or whatever it is number of people who work in OM, Office of Management and Budget, are hacked, and enormous amounts of data collected in one of the most important agencies of our federal government, we got problems. So I think we're gradually making progress, but I talked the other day with an expert in this area. He said some of our technology is 10 years behind on the defensive side. I don't think that's acceptable. I think we've really got to give much greater urgency to all of this than we have.
And your suggestion of a national cyber center, what would the National Cyber Center be responsible for?
Well, one of the big obstacles you have to overcome in cybersecurity is sharing of information. You're not just talking about the government here, you're talking about government and private sector. The private sector has a lot of information that others target, our adversaries target. They're reluctant in the private sector to share information about what they do and can, and that's understandable. but it's not acceptable. We've got to find a way to get better sharing of information between the private and the public sectors on cybersecurity. Now, there's an enormous gap here. Some of our private sector groups are very good, very sophisticated. They know when an attack occurs, they know the extent of it, they have quite capable capabilities, quite effective. On the other hand, there's a large portion of the private sector that doesn't even know when they've been hit and don't know what to do about it once they have been hit. So there's an awful lot of information that has to be shared, and the whole idea of this center is to create a forum in which this sharing can better take place. Here, progress is discernible but not dramatic, and we've got to do a much better job of it.
I just should point out that the Partners for Secure America site has been hacked several times this week.
Is that right?
Yes, right.
Well, at least you know about it.
We know about it now. Yeah, we're trying to fix it.
Progress.
We're trying to fix it. I wanted to maybe ask you at this point in time about the 9/11 Commission, which you co-chaired with Governor with excuse me, with Governor Keane. And they finished the report in 2004 with a whole series of recommendations about how to minimize or avoid the next terrorist attack on the United States. You came up with a series of recommendations. Now that's over a decade ago, but the commission report is still important. There have been a lot of follow-through on that. Are you generally satisfied, even at this late time, that your recommendations have been followed through, or there's something still lacking there?
Governor Keane was the chairman.
Right.
I was the vice chairman.
Right. Okay.
The answer to your question is yes. I think it is among the more successful commissions in the history of the United States government. We had many recommendations, scores of them. A large percentage of them have been accepted, put into practice. A few have been outright rejected. But by and large, it's a pretty remarkable record. Presidents have accepted the recommendations, and they've tried to implement them. And the proof is in the pudding, of course. And what has clearly happened is that we've done a pretty good job on Homeland Security. You have not had a repeat of 9/11. You know, we've not lost a large number of lives. We lost about 3,000 on that terrible day. The record is not perfect. The Boston Marathon occurred. The attack at Fort Bragg, where you had a number of casualties, but not a huge number. So if you look at the record, you have to say that it's a decent record. Not perfect, but a very decent record. Part of that comes about because many of the recommendations have in fact been accepted. One of the major recommendations was sharing of information among the various national security groups. Clearly we've improved at that point, and we're better off than we were. This is not to say another big attack is impossible, but it is to say that the record, having accepted a number of our recommendations, is good. Now, the Congress thought our recommendations were terrific. They enacted a number of them, except those pertaining to the Congress, and they didn't like those, and they have not enacted them, but I think they should.
Thank you for that. Let me shift to another substantive area of the famous, familiar topic of yours, foreign assistance, foreign aid, as we sometimes call it. You were obviously involved in legislation on foreign assistance for many years, the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, and it's one of those issues that is not the most popular issue on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, as you know. I used to like to say, for example, it was always done at late at night and under a blanket with a dim light bulb was the way I used to characterize it, get it through, you know. Yeah. But it does serve an important interest for the United States. How do you see foreign aid, foreign assistance playing a continuing role in the conduct of our foreign policy. And do you think it should be reformed in any way, changed in any way?
When a president faces a foreign policy problem, he asks a number of questions. What are the facts? What's the American national interest? He'll always ask the question, what are the tools I have to deal with it? And of course, he wants to have recommendations. That's the tough part. But foreign policy, foreign assistance should be seen as a tool of the in the foreign policy arsenal of the United States. Not the most important tool, obviously, but it is an important tool. It's not the most important. It breaks down humanitarian and development. Both aspects are important, but I have a kind of a hard-nosed view on foreign assistance. I think we should only give it with conditions, and the conditions we ought to be tough about. Kind of a tough love policy. For example, we're trying to decide at the moment what to do about the peace process in Afghanistan. We give a lot of aid to Pakistan. Some of that aid relates to nuclear weapons and the protection of nuclear weapons, and that's a separate matter. I would devote a considerable portion of our aid to Pakistan and say to the Pakistani government, that aid is conditional. That aid is conditional on you, Pakistan, doing everything you can to encourage the Taliban to negotiate. And if Pakistan didn't do it, I'd cut the aid off. We give too much aid without conditionality. We don't use the aid as effectively as we should. So I want to see us get a lot tougher on the distribution of the aid. Humanitarian aid's a little different. There it's almost always in response to disaster. And you're trying to help people who are in great distress. I think the United States ought to be the leader in that field. And I think we could do ourselves a world of good in this world if sometimes we just put aside the question of national interest and just help people. Children who need vaccinations, people who need food, migrants coming over from North Africa into Europe, drowning in thousands in the Mediterranean. We ought to leap out and be in front in these issues, and it ought to be known throughout the world, as it is to some extent, but not enough in my view, that the United States does a lot of things just to help people in distress, and therefore I want more resources for that. It's not just a question of resources, though. It's a question of adequate resources, well spent, effectively spent, to help people in dire need.
One follow-up on that, because I think it's a very interesting question. Are there arguments that one can make to convince the American people, who are very wary about foreign assistance, and they have wild assumptions about it,
Yes.
as you know, that they could be much more pliable, much more supportive, if you will, or accepting of foreign assistance than they are now?
If you make the reforms I just mentioned, they'd be a lot more supportive of it.
Right.
Part of it is knowledge. A lot of good is done with foreign assistance, and we just need to let people know about that. But I think they also want to know that the money is being spent in the American national interest. So we need to do a better job in the program. I think, however, the objection that the American people, if you ask the American people, do you like foreign aid, most of them will say no, waste of money. But on the other hand, they want America to be decent. They want us to help people in distress, and they want us to help others. I don't think I lost a lot of votes in southern Indiana because I supported foreign aid. People may have had some questions about it. They may have thought I was nuts here and there on some of the issues, but I don't think I lost very many votes on it. Politicians need to speak up for it. They're not going to get hurt by it. And they need to be demanding of a more effective program. But this idea that a politician is going to be defeated because the American people don't like foreign aid, I have a lot of doubt about.
Interesting. Shift to a more geostrategic question on China. As we're hopping along all these issues, I think most people, who are looking at the panorama of issues the United States confronts, it would probably say that now our most important, sensitive bilateral relationship is with China, given where it's come in the last couple of decades or so in terms of its economic and the political importance in the world. Is there a way in which the United States can pursue a policy, on the one hand, that challenges China, for example, in the South China Sea and other issues, while at the same time maintaining a very positive relationship, so that that relationship remains pretty much on course for our interest in the region as well as beyond the region?
Well, first, I think your observation is correct. It's the most important bilateral relationship. It's hard to get there.
Yeah.
The president says he wants to pivot towards Asia. He can't do it. He's so absorbed in the Middle East that he's had a difficult time pivoting towards Asia. But there isn't any doubt the relationship between the U.S. and China is going to determine much of the world environment for the next several decades to come. So we have to really pivot towards Asia, and China does have to become our number one bilateral relationship concern. Historically, there have been elements of confrontation and elements of engagement in our relationship with China. I think that'll continue. It's important to note that every president, regardless of the rhetoric on the campaign trail, China is often in an issue in campaigns.
Sure.
Regardless of the rhetoric, every president has selected the engagement path, rejected the confrontational approach. That's very important. Now, things are changing. And we're at an inflection point with regard to our relationship with China. The president of China talks every day about Asia is for Asians. The clear message is U.S. out. Not entirely, he wouldn't expect that, but he's clearly concerned about U.S. influence in the area. There's an element of thought in the United States today that says the United States must maintain the dominant role in Asia. China will not accept that. Another view is that we must work with China, that China has legitimate interests in the area, that we're going to be a major force there. We're not going to retreat. We're not going to buckle up, buckle under to China. But we recognize that China is a rising power and a very important one, and they have an interest in the area. The good news here is the two countries don't want war. The bad news is there are a lot of tensions building up. You mentioned the South China Sea, China's additional military spending. Taiwan's the toughest issue by all odds. So we've got a lot of tension points with China. What's the solution to it? Well, there isn't any magic solution. But what we have to do is emphasize every possible area of cooperation where we can work together. The private sector is as important as the governmental sector here. I'm still a believer in ping-pong diplomacy, if you can remember that phrase from years past.
Yes.
Terribly important. The ping-pong players got there before Nixon did. And the non-governmental sector can be hugely important here. I want to see farmers and doctors and teachers and lawyers and anthropologists and sociologists and students back and forth. But the most important immediate area is at the military side, where you have to have cooperation. So you want to expand the areas of cooperation, manage the areas of conflict that are going to be present, and you're going to have to do that with high-level diplomacy, constantly at work to try to smooth out rough edges. It is a relationship where we simply have to succeed, and it's going to take a lot of hard work to do it, but it's doable.
Okay, you're very generous with your time. I have one more question. It's an inevitable question that I have to ask you because of the Partnership for Secure America, and that is a question on bipartisanship itself. And do you have any crystal balls about, or any way of, any suggestions about how to improve the role of Congress in terms of generating, bipartisanship and solutions?
Well, institutions like the PSA are very important.
Yeah.
Because you do really make an effort to close the gap, and you've been very constructive in that and helpful. Those kinds of institutions, you're not the only one, but you're an important one, very important one, are exceedingly effective. It's important to keep in mind that the Congress goes through series of patterns or rhythms. Right now, it's in a period of great partisanship. That wasn't always the case. Let's hope that rhythm continues and we get back to more bipartisanship in the future, but it's going to be tougher because of a lot of structural things in our own politics. The principal point is simple. The premise some years ago, when you had Republicans and Democrats meeting in conference committees or at the White House on policy questions, there was a premise. And the premise was, we've got to make an agreement and make the country work. So you had Ronald Reagan, the great conservative, and Tip O'Neill, the great liberal, battling it out with these. I sat in on a number of those meetings. They weren't comfortable meetings. They were civil, but they were oftentimes had a hard edge to them. But Reagan knew that at the end of the day, the Democrats were compromised. The Democrats knew that at the end of the day, Reagan would compromise. And so they reached an agreement in time, not easily, but in time. Now today, that premise doesn't work anymore. The premise often is ideological. It is, I'm going to go into that meeting and make a political speech, my ideological position, and there isn't any sense that I or they have to reach an agreement. So the quick answer is we have to get back as soon as possible to the point where the actors, the politicians, accept the premise that we've got to agree to make the country work. We got a great, big, complicated country. 130 million citizens when I was in high school. 300 and whatever it is, 20 million today. In my working lifetime, the country has far more than doubled. It has become much, much more diverse. And it's harder than ever to make the country work